Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on our latest study on consumer perception and knowledge of the ad-funded internet. My name is Franck. I will be chairing this online event. I am policy lead at IAB Europe. So what we have done with this research, we wanted to assess consumer understanding of the ad-funded internet and their privacy rights. And we wanted to test the hypothesis that European consumers have a nuanced perspective on personalized advertising. So to do that, we commissioned Kantar Media, and we have James joining us today to go through the findings of the study. So James is director at Kantar Media. So just before we get started, I would like to divide the webinar today into two sections. James and I will first outline the methodology and present the key findings of the study, as well as IAB Europe policy recommendation. And then we will answer a question from the audience. So you are invited to type your question in the Q&A box at the end of the presentation. So let's kick off. James, over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and hello to everyone. I'm just going to start some slideshow for you now. Go. Hopefully that's appearing for everyone now, and good afternoon to you all. So as Frank mentioned, my name's James. I'm a director at Kantar Media. I'm also happy to say that I was part of the team that worked on this important study with the IAB. And this afternoon, I'll be taking you through some of the highlights from the research and relating these back to the key policy recommendations the IAB team have proposed based on our findings. So before we get to those key insights, I just wanted to touch very briefly on the research design to help provide some background on where our findings have come from. The research was in two parts. The first was a quantitative study representing EU consumers in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Poland, Sweden, Netherlands, Chechnya, Belgium, Denmark, Republic of Ireland, and Norway. The surveys were run online among adults aged 16 years and over. And the second part of the research was a qualitative focus groups in three key markets of France, Germany, and Poland. The purpose of the groups was to dig a bit deeper into some of the factors driving what we had found in the quantitative research. To maximize the value of the groups, we split our sample into those that were deemed to be ad skeptic or ad positive, having found that around 2/3 of consumers in the population sat at either end of that scale in our quantitative survey. This meant we got views from both sides of helping us get a balanced response, as well as helping with cohesion in the groups. The groups were also asked to complete a 3-day worksheet beforehand, helping prompt them to think a bit more deeply about their online experience before joining us. Now, before we move on to our findings, I would just also like to remind you that there is a full report and document available on the IAB website. So if you'd like to learn more about the methodology and, more importantly, the findings from the research, please do check that out. So there are three key messages that we believe should be taken from the research based on what we have seen. The first, there is a clear value to ads, with EU consumers heavily utilising free or subsidised online services. Number two, consumers opt for personalisation when they trust the site and understand the value exchange. And the third, consumers' trust and familiarity with sites influences their decision to consent. In our survey, we asked about a range of 12 different service categories, and here we see the top 4 based on claimed usage in the last month. The key thing to note, though, is just how much of this content is being consumed by those that at least partially access for free. This around 9 in 10 that we see here in the column that's just come on screen, level of free access was consistent across all the categories we looked at, other than the streaming services of things like TV, film, and music, where it dropped to around 7 in 10 among users saying that they accessed for free. What we also see is just how much these services would be really missed by users if they were no longer able to get access to them, highlighting the importance of maintaining that access for so many people. Now, this is further highlighted by the numbers who are accessing these different types of services now for free and would not be willing to pay for access. Here is the full list of 12 services we asked about, and we can see that product reviews on the left there is a great example of something many of us use for free and help us a great deal when making often important purchase decisions, but is not something that many would welcome paying for. So 64% of free users saying they'd be unwilling to pay for it. Email, on the other hand, sits at the other end of the chart, a key service most of us use regularly and for free, but in this case, many would feel obliged to start paying for it if they had to. We can also overlay the percentage of those unwilling to pay who said that affordability would be a key issue, stopping them paying for the services. And we start to see that there would potentially be a minority being left behind for financial reasons for what are often now seen as critical services. Therefore, removing that ability to access these services would potentially add to social issues and a tiered internet experience. We estimate that it is a huge amount of value that consumers are receiving each month without that need to pay. So now we are not saying that people would pay this amount, but to try and give us a sense of what they are getting, we did a simple calculation that estimated the average price being paid by those that do pay for services, and then applying these averages to the equivalent services being used for free by our consumers. This just helps us to show how much value is being funded primarily by advertising, and also gives a real sense of how hard it would be for many of these services that we have seen are relied on by consumers to function without it. Again, if you would like to know more about how these calculations were done, the report is available for download on the IAB Europe website. So having explored the need for a well-funded advertising model to deliver services, we also wanted to explore how consumers felt about providing their data as part of this solution. Firstly, here on the screen, we see that when asked if giving consent felt like a fair trade-off to use a site's services without charge, 8 in 10 either agreed or were neutral to this statement, with just 19% disagreeing to that. Later on in the study, after we had prompted our respondents a bit further on their use of services and advertising's role in this, we also asked about pay or consent banners, where consumers are given a choice. If they want to access the service, they either need to pay or provide their consent. That's the only way they'll be allowed in. And again, we saw that most consumers, 6 in 10 in that mindset, saw this as a reasonable request for sites to make. This brings us to our first two policy recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, James. So it was clear from James' presentation that ad-funded services provide significant value to consumers. So policymakers should fully recognize these benefits when they address the issue of personalized advertising. This means that any policy initiative should pass some tests. The first one, does this make online content and services more exclusive or more inclusive? Does this lead to more consumer choice online or less consumer choice? These are important tests to pass to preserve the consumer benefits of personalized advertising. What comes also quite clearly from the study is that consumer attitudes toward personalized advertising can shift, in particular when actually consumers learn more about the value exchange behind the digital services they use every day. So this should guide how policymakers approach consumer information. Policymakers should consider cooperation initiatives with the industry, but also with other stakeholders that explain how personalized advertising funds online services, how personal data is used to target ads, and what rights consumers have.
Thank you, Frank. So this next section of today's presentation then brings us on to the actual experience of consumers with adverts. In the green bars, we see that for these different types of relevant advert, there was often a positive response. For example, if seeing an ad for something they intended to buy, nearly 3/4 saw a positive in this. That positivity then dropping when the relevance is no longer there. So, for example, an advert for something already purchased, as shown as the blue bar, that positivity level drops to 43% in terms of what we see. We also see that consumers attitudinally prefer to see adverts that are relevant to them. 56% agreeing they prefer to see relevant ads over more random ones, with just 16% disagreeing with that. 53% agreeing it is better to get fewer personalized ads than lots of generic ones, again with 14% disagreeing with that statement. And then 52% agreeing they prefer the ad to be relevant to them rather than being just based on the website, with 18% disagreeing with that. So a clear sense that many consumers are open to better quality, more relevant ads as a funding format over more generic advertising that might also need to increase the numbers shown to match the kind of funding levels sites and services are getting now. Here are two examples from our qualitative research of consumers having positive experiences with ads they have seen recently. The German example on the left of the screen as you look at it, speaking to that idea of planning to make a visit and the positive experience of then seeing a well-executed creative that supported that plan for them. On the right, our Oreo example also shows how the right ads can be seen as beneficial if it is a relevant product for them. Now, when we ask consumers about why they would accept data collection on a site, we see how important familiarity and trust are in making consumers comfortable to do this. We also see that when it comes to accepting collection, regular visiting and making things easier are important factors. Again, in the report, we go further into this, including looking at different countries, as well as what drives consumers when they decide to reject collection. We also had a quiz element in the survey that explored levels of knowledge and gaps around digital privacy and advertising. So please do take a look if you would like to know more. I'm going to hand back to Franck to talk about the next two.
Yeah, listening to James' presentation, consumers value relevance and convenience in online advertising, but also they prioritize data privacy and control. Actually, effective protection of personal data can coexist with consumer convenience. So we believe that existing legislation, such as the DSA, the GDPR, can effectively balance these competing interests. If these regulations are properly implemented, they would mitigate consumer concern over data misuse while preserving the benefits of personalized advertising. Another interesting finding is that consumers prefer fewer ads over a lot of untargeted ads. This is something that the industry is doing with tools that limit ad frequency. But the current interpretation of the e-privacy directive impedes these efforts because it requires consent for techniques essential to improving the consumer experience online. So the European Commission should use the upcoming fitness check of data regulation to better align existing legislation and in particular the privacy directive with consumer expectations.
Thanks, Franck. So moving on to this next section, as I mentioned, we did explore in detail the levels of knowledge of our consumers in both the quantitative and qualitative research stages. And our conclusion was that most consumers have what we would describe as a functional understanding of digital privacy, if not a deep one, as illustrated by this quote from our groups. So I can name GDPR and even the Personal Data Protection Act in Poland, but I still don't know all of the details. And we saw that quite consistently across both the quantitative and qualitative research that we did. This leads us on to a question we asked early on in our survey about how they felt about online privacy laws and the protection they provide. What we found was that around a quarter of consumers said that they felt confident and in control. So that's our top box in green there. If we look at the two boxes in blue at the bottom, just over 1 in 10 said that they did not feel protected. And that same proportion, just over 1 in 10, said that they did not feel in control because they lacked understanding themselves. The biggest group, shown in the grey bar here, which just over half of our respondents put themselves in, was those that said they felt that the privacy laws did give them control, they just lacked confidence that they were being followed by companies. This raises the point that it is a perception of compliance rather than stricter regulation that consumers will more likely perceive would help improve their experience. We also looked at what consumers felt they needed from the consent banners they are seeing online. We heard back from them about a desire for them to be clear, concise, consistent, and creative to help consumers understand, make informed decisions quickly, but also engage them with that consent banner request. So those examples here, I know that by accepting these cookies, I agree that my personal data is collected under GDPR for statistics purposes, but I never really delve into what that means. And maybe the banners should be a bit more standardized. And we heard consistently messages around this, particularly from the Qual. So I'm going to hand back to Franck now to go through the last two policies.
Yeah, thank you. To essentially close the presentation. So as you just said, on consent banners, our research shows that consumer wants clarity, relevance, and minimal disruption. So policymakers should enable this by supporting industry efforts, such as the transparency and consent framework that was developed by IAB Europe. This can be achieved by encouraging the development of GDPR code of conduct, which are underutilized. And all of this will facilitate business compliance with GDPR while reducing consent fatigue. So let's come back to the findings regarding consumer attitudes toward privacy law. Many Europeans remain uncertain about how well privacy regulations are enforced. This trust gap must be addressed. So we believe that the GDPR and the DSA already provide very strong consumer safeguards. So instead of adding a new layer of legislation, policymakers should prioritize risk-based enforcement, targeting serious infringement of fundamental rights. What is also needed is consistent and effective implementation. That's why the upcoming digital simplification package needs to address diverging interpretation of data protection rules across member states, but also should streamline GDPR compliance. All of this is key to restore consumer confidence online, but also to boost the competitiveness of the European digital advertising industry. So we spent the last 15 minutes, almost 20 minutes, going through the findings of the study and highlighting our policy recommendation. So you can find the full report of the study on IAB Europe website. You can scan the QR code that will be displayed on the slide. So now let's open the floor to questions from the audience. And maybe, so you can type your question in the Q&A box on Zoom. It would be good if you could mention your organization when you type your question. So I let you add your question. In the meantime, I have already a question for you, James. So we tested the level of consumer knowledge of privacy legislation, also the understanding of personalized advertising. And interestingly, Kantar has used an innovative tool in the survey, a true and false quiz. So James, can you explain to our audience the main result of this quiz?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to do that. So we asked a mixture, as you mentioned, of true and false statements and gave our respondents the options to say true, false, or skip, with the idea being that they would then try and get as high a score as possible, and we'd give them their score at the end. So they wouldn't necessarily be likely to randomly guess as much as we would if we just give them the options to click against. And across all of those statements, on average, consumers got just over 60% correct. So that got us to that idea of that kind of like functional level of knowledge that we also heard about in the qualitative research as well. They tended to be good at understanding what companies could use past online behavior, for example, with permissions to do things. But where we tended to see the bigger gaps in knowledge were around areas like consent banners appearing every time on the site. So a bit of more understanding about some of that benefit of clicking those consent banners and them not reappearing would be good, as well as some like common misconceptions that you hear about in the market about like devices kind of illegally listening to people or things like that. They were perceiving these kind of things happening. But also one of the big things that came up was that companies need to collect that consent or they will face severe fines. People didn't necessarily tend to know those things quite as well as some of the other points and things like that we heard about.
Thank you, James. I think we have already a quite a question on the chat. It's quite long, but I will read it through. Pretty sure, James, you can read it as well. I think it's around the interpretation of the findings. So we have on one side 50% of users that agree with the statement, giving a website consent to process personal data is a fair value exchange for free access. And there is another chart in your presentation where, with a very different statistic, only 15% of respondents saying, I understand the purpose of data collection and I'm comfortable accepting it. The question is whether there is a contradiction between the two answers. I think it's not actually the same question we ask. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more, James, on this.
Yeah, I think I can't see the question, but I think if I'm understanding what the question is about, there's a sense of consumers being comfortable with some of what they see and open those kind of things when they have it clearly explained to them. And then there's this question about whether or not they feel like they fully understand what they're doing. And I think this comes back to the idea of functional knowledge. Most of us get by on the internet. We understand enough to feel like we can click on the banners or do those kind of things, and we can't feel comfort enough to do those types of things. But maybe when we start to ask people and probe a bit deeper into that level of knowledge, they don't necessarily feel like they have that full understanding of exactly how everything is working. So I think it's those two sides of the kind of coin, or those two different elements of it, that we're probably seeing there in terms of that.
Great. Maybe I have another question on my side. During the elaboration of the questionnaire, we ask also consumer how they see the impact of losing access to free online services on people's lives, but also more broadly on society. And there are like some interesting insight from the result of the survey. But maybe can you please expand a bit on that, James?
Yes, of course. So there's a lot of this in the report, but just as I'm highlighting kind of points in terms of what we see, I know consumers perceive issues around getting information they might need, increasing social issues like isolation, but then also a lot of these services and getting access to a mix of them, helping to ensure the quality of the service that they receive and the financial equality for consumers being particularly important. So I think some of what we've really been learning there is that these services aren't just about entertainment, and even some of the ones that we might think of more as being about entertainment, whether those things be social media and things like that, actually they're fulfilling quite important roles for people in terms of their day-to-day lives, whether that's communication, not feeling socially isolated, but also on other sides of things around kind of financial matters and those types of things as well. So it's really important that we allow people to get access to these services, and also that they get a spread of access to different services rather than becoming just siloed into just a few in terms of what we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you. That's probably really a sense of clarity here. Really open to hear some, in fact, not to hear, but if you would like to raise any question, please type in the Q&A box. We would be happy to answer to them. If not, actually, I have another question. Maybe we can share with the audience, because we didn't go through into the details during the presentation. Is the issue of consent banners. It was a key pillar from the study. So we tested how consumers behave actually when they face a generic consent banner. And so I would like to explore this a bit more. So what are the main findings actually from the study on this, James?
So in general, when we ask people, just as an upfront question, we showed a consent banner. And again, you can see the report. We give some examples of the kind of things that we were showing people in the questionnaire. When we showed people a generic style consent banner, they tended to say that they accepted all when they saw those types of things. There was a bit of variation between some of the markets. So in Germany, they were slightly less likely to say, for example, that they might accept all, although still a large proportion of them were saying that they tended to accept all, versus Sweden, where we saw a bigger proportion saying that they tended to accept all in terms of when they see that generic consent banner. What was interesting, though, was that when we started asking consumers to think about different types of site and scenario, those levels varied a bit more, especially when familiarity and trust started to be brought into play in terms of what they were thinking about when they were going on to those different types. So these behaviors are likely to be a bit more nuanced than we might first think. Therefore, helping people understand more will potentially have a positive impact on them and their likelihood to consent, but also their likelihood to really understand what they're doing and why they're making those decisions.
Thank you, James. Maybe a follow-up question more related to the personalized advertising section. So a clear conclusion from the study is that personalized advertising resonates more with consumer, but also we tested actually what types of data, the attitude, consumer attitude towards some different types of data that are used to personalize ads. Also, there was very interesting findings, also very interesting dynamics, like demographic dynamics. James, can you elaborate a bit more on this?
Yeah, so I think there's some really interesting stuff in the report, and if you go into that and take a look, but some of the things that we see there are around, like, yes, there's different groups. So in terms of the types of data, to address that before we get into the groups, maybe to start off with, what we tend to see is that people are generally quite open to the idea of their behaviors online being used to help serve personalized advertising to them. Those types of things they can understand, and they can see like how that works and why that might work and why that might drive relevance. Seems to be the case. When we go down those different types of personalization, what we start to see is things like hyperlocation maybe starts to make people feel a bit more uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is advertising that seems to be kind of really understanding that you within like a 500-meter radius where you are, and then serving those ads to you. Those types of things start to become maybe a little bit more uncomfortable for some individuals in terms of what we see. That's not to say that everyone is against those things, and equally it's not to say that everyone's positive about the other things. It's just to say that when we talk about personalization and how those things are served, we should also think about some of those different dynamics and some of those different types of data that are being used, because clearly that also makes a difference in terms of that consumer experience. In terms of the groups then, as we might expect, in general, what we tend to see is those younger groups, but also those ones that are more digitally savvy and happy in terms of their internet experience tend to be a bit more open to things. And maybe some of those tend to be a bit older, but then also those kind of less comfortable online, maybe a little less savvy and thing. But there's also some interesting dynamics there that happen around kind of like the understanding of knowledge. Actually, there are groups, and this speaks to some of what we were talking about previously, there are groups within the population that just seem happy. They're just open to accepting, they're open to doing things, and actually they aren't desperately seeking huge amounts of more information necessarily. They're just happy to kind of accept, consent, they'll see the adverts and those types of things, where there's other groups within the population who are maybe a little bit more nervous, but actually they're also the ones that are trying to learn more and understand more in terms of what they're doing. So there's some really interesting dynamics there. And again, if you're interested, I would definitely recommend going away and taking a look at the report.
Indeed, indeed. So I guess it's time to close. So if you would like to read a bit more about the findings, please download the report on IAB Europe website. Also, if you have any specific question you want to explore more, some aspect of the study, feel free to drop us online. We will be happy to follow up with you separately. So I would like to thank James. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And of course, a bigger thanks goes to the online attendees. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to seeing you again. Bye.